A pleasure to meet all at last, and here we are at it again with video games that are totally awesome. Now, I've mentioned about Dead Rising in many different ways. I've covered it multiple times over the course of the entirety of my channel, well, minus the few primordial years, from 2008 to 2010, because I did not actually get the first game until that point in 2010. And the following year, Christmas 2011, was when I got Dead Rising 2. A unique sequel, that of which I was more than excited for, because having played through the first game a couple different times, by the end of 2011, I was actually more than excited to get my own copy of the game itself. And this was, in fact, one of the first times that I had gotten an M-rated game with a lot of gore in mind, as well as many other things to worry about here, but it basically happened. I got a copy of the game that Christmas, and since then, it was more than just probably one of the best gifts I could have gotten, period. Aside from that, there were a few other games on the Xbox 360 that I had also gotten in 2011, but I'll get to those some other time. For this instance, I would like to talk about Dead Rising 2 as a whole, and like the first game, it also got itself a remaster in 2016, and there was also an alternate version of Dead Rising 2 called Dead Rising 2 Off the Record, which came out that same year in 2011. Months before Christmas, of course, but still, I'll have plenty to discuss in both ways. The main thing about the original Dead Rising 2 is that it has a new protagonist. We don't exactly get Frank West. As with some franchises, it can be common for the main protagonist to change depending on the circumstances regarding the plot, storyline, or of course if there's complications regarding budgeting or whom produced the film or directed the film. A lot of different variables are in place to ensure that it all adds up and helps make sense as to why things are different with the sequels when the original does something far different than what we got. Anyways though, Dead Rising 2, the main thing about it is that Chuck Green is our new main protagonist. We don't exactly get Frank West, although he plus the story has been told many times. There of course was the unique trailer in which that it did promote a cliff note of the first game's plot, in which that Frank West, photojournalist, 36 at the time in 2006, had uncovered a certain conspiracy planned by the US government, whom attempted to sabotage his scoop and try to cover up the truth. But because of what happened in Santa Cabeza, and as a result what would happen in Willamette, Colorado, Frank had basically learned about the Keyes family, their involvement in the mass zombie outbreaks that occurred, and of course the experimentations made by the one and only Dr. Barnaby. As I've discussed in the last episode of Video Games That Are Totally Awesome, it's a pretty long one, but I will see if I can make this one a bit shorter for the sake of some people's viewership and attention span. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and kick things off here. The game begins, or could I say, the real beginning takes place in a pre-build game, a demo if you will, called Case Zero, which takes place a little bit before the events of Dead Rising 2 are set to take place, where Chuck Green and Katie are traveling around in an outskirt. They have to refuel their pickup, but unfortunately a robber gets by and steals it, leaving Chuck and Katie out with no one to help. And the whole thing ends basically with a combination of a junkyard owner getting crushed and the military coming in an attempt to arrest the two of them. But they successfully make their way out via a motorbike, and eventually they get on to their pickup, where Chuck straps into his Ishiak racing jacket, as he was, according to lore, a former motocross champion. But now he is not only retired, but also trying to spend more time with his family. And even more so because of a couple things that happened. As we saw in Case Zero, well, Chuck Green has to explain to Katie that her mother was not herself. In other words, she turned into one of the undead, biting Katie and making her a zombie. Or at least they would think that she would be a zombie because of the bite mark that's on her hand. However, there is in fact a flip side to all this. Because by this point in the plot, years had actually passed when the first Dead Rising game took place in 2006, same year as the game's own release date. Dead Rising 2 takes place in 2011, about a year after its own release, which happened in 2010. But the thing is that apart from being slightly ahead into the future, kind of like another game I've talked about, Heavy Rain, Dead Rising 2 itself does start almost immediately before the events of the main game itself. Because any of those who played Case Zero, well, we don't exactly get Case Zero or even another DLC known as Case West, which takes place after Dead Rising 2. But anyways, to avoid putting together more time for all the other stuff, I'll just get going with the main game here. The main game of Dead Rising 2 takes place inside of an arena. We get to see Chuck Green prepping his bike and allowing for Katie to be escorted into the nearby green room while she'll await for her father. The purpose for Chuck Green to be in that arena, along with the motorbike, is of course to participate in a program known as Terror is Reality. This televised broadcast is brought upon by the great Tyrone King, or TK for short, along with his two female assistants, the Bailey sisters. But the thing is that Chuck Green, he has three opponents to face, including a rival / follower of his work, Leon Bell, whom is pretty boastful and narcissistic in comparison to Chuck's somewhat kind, serious attitude. It kind of gives off a sort of Batman vibe to most things, in which case that, in spite of him being on a more gentle and soft side, he still has an knack for wanting to protect his daughter and a lot of pride in what he does in his life. The motocross championships that he has gone through over the years more than solidified his character, and his development will only further increase as this game progresses. So the main goal in this part of the game is of course to win the competition. By doing so, modified motorbikes with chainsaw attachments, which proves to be a critical component in this game's gameplay, will in fact be used to decimate loads of zombies. The fact is, Terror is Reality in this instance is offering a large cash prize to the winner, and depending on how well you do, well, you could walk away with that cash prize. And I will say, cash will also play a pretty big role in this game, as I will discuss it in a moment here. Anyways, when he does finish, he goes to the locker room. Some of his rivals do come in as well to congratulate him, and a news broadcast comes up on the nearby TV, in which that there is a protest group known as Cure. This is basically sort of like what you might expect from old school hippies, but in a more modernized fashion here. The setting of this game, in comparison to the first game, which was in Willamette, Colorado, Dead Rising 2 takes place in Fortune City. Not at all like how it was in Case Zero, where it was more of an outskirt of Las Vegas, which was technically a bit of an outbreak in and of itself. You see, 5 years had passed since the events of the first Dead Rising game, and the zombie outbreak, despite the efforts of the government as well as many other forces, they tried to keep it contained within the city. The zombies spread outside of Willamette, inevitably so. The likes of Frank West and Isabella Keys had more than contributed to, get this, an anti-zombie drug program called Zombrex. This formula, which was a unique derivative of Isabella's Queen formula that she used to inject into Frank West, the two have since made a lot of progress. And being that there was an official drug for growth inhibition of the parasites, it really goes to show they were more than determined to find out the best possible way to at least treat the problem while the search for the cure still goes on. Of course, Chuck Green is determined to find this cure for his daughter Katie, because he no longer wants to be a burden on her, and she no longer needs to be a burden on him. And while they try to find a safe haven by continuing to go further towards the west, likely to California, which in and of itself becomes its own Dead Rising story, which we'll have to save for another time. The thing is, though, is that despite the fact that Fortune City seems to be yet another piece of zombie containment, mostly in the forms of the Terrorist Reality program, it unfortunately does set the pace for what would eventually turn out to be yet another big outbreak. You see, even though Chuck Green had been able to get out with the money in hand, and with praise/criticism coming from some people, even a little encounter with the Bailey sisters on his way to the elevator. Unfortunately, the power goes out and the elevator gets stuck. He has to manually open it, and when he does, something happens. People are freaking out, screaming, running down the hallway, and we eventually get to see a zombie. Yep, a guy gets bit, turns into one of them within seconds, and starts to go after Chuck. But luckily, another survivor wasn't looking where he was going and ended up getting grappled by the zombie, allowing for Chuck to get out of the elevator and escape. He goes to the green room where he finds Katie, and the two decide to make their way out of the arena and to find a shelter as soon as possible. They barely make it out of there, and I will admit it is a bit of a challenge to have Katie in tow while trying to find your way out here. But one unique thing that you can do to defend yourself while carrying somebody, you can kick, which I find to be pretty effective most of the time. It can also be useful for knocking down large groups of zombies that may be in your way, and surprisingly, we don't exactly get much zombie attacks while we're carrying these people. I get the feeling that some might have found it to be quite a frustrating challenge to try and carry people while being attacked by large groups of zombies at the same time, so maybe they allowed the AI and the zombies to be a little more lenient. Either way you look at it, though, they find a nearby safe house in which that they run to along with some other survivors. Once the door is closed behind them, there was no going back. What has turned into a peaceful Las Vegas 2.0 is now essentially another Willamette. But the doors in front of them do open. We can see a member of the security, whose name is later revealed to be Sullivan. And alongside a few other people that we get to meet as well, this safe house basically becomes the main base, much like the security room in the first game. Except here, there's a lot more room to explore, and there's also a lot more room for extra survivors. Compared to the first game, Dead Rising 2 opts to be bigger and better. There's a lot more production value into this, not just greater cutscenes and more incredible dialogue sequences, but we also get lots more variety in terms of weapons, survivors, and psychopath boss battles. I will say that the creativity factor in these psychopath battles are probably way more diverse than with the first game, and somewhat quirky in a way, as some might put it. But I will basically discuss those in appropriate parts of this video. Anyways, though, upon getting to know each other and upon discovering what happened to Katie, Sullivan and Chuck come to the agreement that, well, even though there's Zombrex in tow, there won't be any for 3 days. Because since the outbreak occurred, the military's first priority would be to quarantine Fortune City before moving in at first light, 3 days from that point. And so, we have the stage set up. The same old premise in which that a 72-hour time period until the military finally rolls in, to where we eventually get either a saving grace or something worse that happens. Well, in the same way that the first game had given us a 72-hour period until Frank's ride, which was a helicopter that ended up crashing, had occurred, we could probably predict that this case, in Fortune City, the military could come in and maybe some twist would happen that causes everything to go further down into the depths of the inferno. But until that happens, we get to have Chuck and Katie meet and Green, along with staying inside the safe house, Stacy Forsythe, the leader of Cure, was also inside as well. So I guess you could say that in spite of the disagreements that Chuck and Stacy have with each other, there is in fact the likelihood that they couldn't get along here. As everybody knows, there's always the chance in which that even though some people might turn on each other in the faces of the apocalypse, it might not always be true. There's gonna be a good amount of people that are still around wanting to do things that are right rather than what's wrong. As we know, the apocalypse is always going to be the setting for a number of different disagreements, whether it be political or whether it be moral. But either way you look at it, nobody needs to do everything their way or anyone else's way. Yet, this is more about the basis of survival. And Dead Rising 2 made sure to do it. Well, the thing is that as the story goes on, and as Chuck Green explores Fortune City with all the different locations in mind, you have several casinos, a mall, in outskirts, large segments of outdoor areas, as well as plenty of shopping centers, restaurants, and even clubs. You could say that Fortune City was probably a lot more larger than what the Willamette Parkview Mall had to offer. After all, this is a lot like Las Vegas. And I will say that the casino segments of Fortune City are probably the strongest holdings in the entirety of the setting. While we still do get a nice variety of other locations, the outdoor segments alone, I will say, probably have much more variety of things to work with here. You don't really get just a park with some lakes, shafts, and walking areas with flower beddings and whatnot. No. Unlike the first game, the outdoor segments of Fortune City and Dead Rising 2 have way more to offer. I mean, you got different shops to look into, including toy stores, restaurants, hardware stores, a gun shop, and there's even a stage for concerts out in that area. I also should mention that at some point in the game, there are maintenance rooms. Maintenance rooms are especially a big important segment of Dead Rising 2 because creativity and DIY are absolutely nothing when you compare to the idea of combination weapons. Yeah, Dead Rising 2, unlike with the first game, gave us the unique idea of combining different items together to create deadly weapons. Some of the most common, of course, are the Wolverine-style boxing gloves with knives attached, the spiked bats, and of course, we can't forget about the unique combination of an NFL ball and some grenades, called the Hail Mary. Some other popular picks, of course, will include the Electric Crusher, the power of a car battery mixed with the weight of a sledgehammer, the Roaring Thunder, which of course used the unique idea of combining the electrical powers of the battery with a mask. And while there's plenty of other different ideas out there, you sure cannot beat just the idea of combining different things to create some unique killer weaponry that also allows for more durability, which is more of an added bonus in and of itself. Plus the damage and unique gore that comes into play also gives out free prestige points, or PP for short. Much like the first game, the progression system in Dead Rising 2 also allows for a multitude of different upgrades. There's upgrades to your health, your inventory, there's upgrades to your movement speed, as well as the addition of new moves that you can pull off by pulling off different button combinations, like in the first game. But it also gives you the idea of some new weapons, combo weapons for the most part. There's also a variety of combo weapons that you can unlock by getting a feel of your surroundings. For example, if you walk up to the poster of Blood Round 4, that basically gives you the Tenderizers combo card. Mixing some nails with mixed martial artist gloves gives you the unique idea of sticking it to the zombies. And I will admit, IGN had done a fantastic job describing this game in a multitude of ways, especially showing us how the combo weapons just go way beyond the norm. And I will admit, the IGN segment was pretty much a two-parter, because back in the day, videos that were longer than 15 minutes weren't really common, and when they were, it was mostly because certain requirements had to be made. But nowadays, that requirement's pretty much been freed up. So you could probably put up 15-minute videos or longer anytime you want. In any case though, with all that stuff that comes around, survivors being rescued and clues being discovered on what's been going on, there eventually comes the framery of Chuck Green. You see, Rebecca Chang, a local reporter who was covering the incident as it was going on, eventually leaked out security footage of whom appeared to be Chuck Green setting explosives to the gates that were holding the zombies in and releasing them. So, we got a pretty big problem on our hands here. It's not just the zombies or the survival of Katie Green, but now Chuck has to deal with a circumstance involving a certain perpetrator whom is attempting to sabotage his reputation and use him as bait for something bigger. So, Chuck Green is now being reeled into all of this, with people claiming that he is responsible for this incident. That really is quite a way to amp things up here. An angered Chuck Green decides to make his way over to the hotel where he gets to meet up with Rebecca Chang. She saves his life at the last second, and the two exchange a few words here and there. She practically comes on to him like she's his wife or something. Kind of creepy. But we know that Chuck Green was not at all responsible for this sort of thing. And even Stacy had to agree with him. Cure had no involvement in any of this. And the only reason why Chuck had affiliation with Cure was because he only went to one meeting with them once after the death of his own wife. But of course, it probably gets even better here, because the thing is that Stacy and Chuck, they probably didn't know about Rebecca's true intentions here. She, of course, had so-called privileged information on her. The sources of the information that supposedly told her that it was Chuck who caused all this, and what led Chuck to getting to her. Some reason she has to keep the whole entire thing secret all to herself and this sort of information. Well, a central security room is where the two eventually travel to, in which that Rebecca decides to pick the lock. Kind of an added bonus for some cheeky reporter. But nonetheless, they eventually find that everybody's inside is dead. And what's more, there's not much that they could do about it. Chuck, however, is called back by Stacy, warning him that Sullivan intends to kick everybody out, including Katie and Stacy. Chuck quickly makes it back, interferes, and explains what's really going on. And well, it does seem that even Rebecca was invited along. Either that or she didn't know that she was not supposed to enter without permission. But still, she is allowed inside nonetheless, because she could be a helpful component to this mystery. In any case, though, it's around this point in time where we do get to see many things happen. There, of course, is the unique transformation of the zombies at nighttime. Much like with the first game, as soon as it hits 7 o'clock, well, the zombies' eyes glow red and everything gets crazier. Much more difficult even. The zombies are much stronger, faster, and they can also take away more of your health. You could say that at nighttime, the zombies are even more powerful than they usually are. At the end of the day, though, there's a lot of psychopaths you can fight against, including a guy from Cure. And then, of course, there eventually comes a point where we get to meet up with TK himself. Because what happens is that Chuck eventually goes down into the underground tunnel system where a number of maintenance centers, storage rooms, warehouses, and etc., and even a railroad are all put underneath. These tunnels supply their own trains, which in turn supply a majority of freight and cargo for various segments of Fortune City. However, a lot of mercenaries are around, and TK is involved in this as well. So, when Chuck goes in to investigate, taking out the armed mercenaries, whom have loads of assault rifles and other weaponry, he eventually gets to the train where more mercenaries appear, and when he takes him down, he finally sees TK clapping for him as he walks up. It turns out Tyrone King may or may not be the real person responsible for all this. Someone who was wearing Chuck's show outfit, walking up to those cages, releasing those zombies like free tigers, and letting them roam around the city and slaughtering everybody. Well, it does seem that TK could be the main man at large. But because he gets away, they can't determine it at this time. So they decide to head back and try at it again some other point in time. There's a number of other things that we get to see along the way as well. More psychopath boss fights, more progression, more combo cards, as well as more skills and more level ups can occur here just as well. But on top of all that, when we finally get to the point in which that more cases can be unlocked, it turns out we'll get another encounter with TK. This time, he, his assistant, and his mercenaries are all out there in an effort to, well, they're now robbing the city. They're using large drills, armored trucks, to break into the vaults of the casinos. And all three of these casinos, from the Americana to the Yucatan, are all being robbed of all the money that's inside. So what does Chuck have to do? Well, we can especially be sure that after he had the courage to face up against the Bailey sisters and rescue Rebecca, well, he could probably take on anybody at this point. And well, sabotaging TK's plan, foiling his robbery of all that money. And well, that's what he does. By going to each of these casinos, taking down the mercenaries, and eventually destroying the drills that are being used to break open the vaults, alongside the trucks that are being used to load the money, well, when they're all destroyed, TK is rather frustrated. It makes more sense now that he is truly being the real mastermind behind this plot in Fortune City's zombie outbreak and the many other problems that could be coming around because of what he's done. So, we don't get to see him again for some time until another night comes by. In which case, our third encounter with TK is even more crazy. That same hotel where Chuck first met with Rebecca is apparently now being used as a helipad to transport whatever money they got left, especially after the foliage of those casino robberies. So, with just one crate worth of cash, TK is hoping to make it out of the city with extra money in tow. Apart from all the crap that had happened with Terror is a Reality, why would he be so greedy and trying to not only be a guy responsible for starting a zombie outbreak, but get away on a helicopter with large sums of cash in tow? Would he try to use the zombie apocalypse as a cover-up for these sort of robberies? Or is this just his way of saying that he hopes to do his show business in a whole different way? Either way you look at it, this sort of illegal stunt is not going unpunished. Chuck gets to the top of the building and eventually hooks onto the helicopter's landing pads, causing it to get stuck. TK and his assistant do try to resist, using the machine gun attached to the helicopter, but as we know, Chuck is able to throw a bunch of objects at the rotors, which is something most people will do. Rather than shoot at it or do all sorts of stuff here, there's a lot of objects that they hide on top of the roof, including saw blades, wood chunks, hard hats, and many other things as well. They can all be used to damage the rotors on the helicopter, and once you do it enough, the helicopter eventually loses control, TK falls out, falls unconscious, and when the copter explodes, it starts to rain partially burned dollar bills. Proving once and for all that the whole connection between TK and the zombies was indeed accurate. Chuck made his first claim in those underground tunnels, and now we have Chuck Green with TK at his feet. And with Rebecca nearby, it seems that the true report is actually going to come out. Chuck's way and the rest of the way here. Most might still not have known about Chuck's name being cleared up here, but at least they are more than closer to solving this case. Well, they bring in TK, he gets handcuffed to the bed, And well, the report basically adds up here. TK was behind this whole thing all along. Killed all these people, framed Chuck, Stacy, and the others for it, in order to make some extra money. Not just from the vaults that he tried to rob, but also from possibly many other places he could have looted just as well. And you know, speaking of looting, that's one big other thing about this game itself. Apart from the mercenaries you fight against, there's also other guys who might try to steal money from you. These are known as looters. There was a segment earlier in the game in which that to try and find more Zombrex for Katie, we had to go through a pharmacy that was being ransacked by crooks. And well, after defeating these guys, they certainly weren't the last ones to be seen out there. And what's more, some looters actually volunteer to help Chuck. They run their own pawn shops throughout the city, and they do sell a variety of different things for you to have. Combo weapons, various items, including hard to find pieces. Zombrex itself is also on sale. But you just need to make sure to have one thing: money, and lots of it. A few ways that you can pull it off is of course by using the hacker device, a combination weapon involving a flashlight. By zapping the ATMs, you can get large sums of cash, usually between $10,000 and $25,000. The same thing can also happen with various other machinery, including the casino's machinery. There, of course, are lots of things you can do inside the casinos just as well, including gambling your money away at the slot machines, or even going into those famous cash twisters. Basically a room with a giant fan blowing cash all over the place. Try to grab as much money as you can before time runs out. And while there's many other mini games that you can play just as well within the game's environment itself to earn some extra cash, there's always the chance that extra cash can also be made by just randomly finding it on the ground. Yeah. Also, destroying cash registers would work, and many other things just as well. So I feel like that the looting segment / segue of this episode of video games that are totally awesome helps to make more sense as to the many things that are around for Dead Rising 2 fans who want to hear me talk about them. But anyways, let's get back to the story at hand here. TK is of course still unconscious, and Chuck intends to keep him around while others might disagree, because if he's truly as much of scum, capital punishment wouldn't be worth it, but needing him alive would very much be more than worth it. Letting the system deal with TK rather than these guys themselves probably would be more helpful. How else are you supposed to get the upper hand in justice? Anyways though, we do get to have more free time for ourselves before we do once again have to meet up with our main cast just as well. We also have more Zombrex around that we need to find, as there are a number of spots. For example, there's a casino where you can go backstage and you'll find a Zombrex on top of some crates in the storage room. There's also Zombrex that you can find in the maintenance tunnels as well. And as I mentioned before, there was a pharmacy earlier in the game in which they had Zombrex in the back as well. So those are just a few examples in which that I can give you as tips where to find some, should you be struggling with any, that is. But when TK finally does awaken, well, they do try to pry him with all the questionnaires and stuff like that. Of course, he's a bit resilient and has his own funny lingo. Tries to play jokes on everybody and stuff. But they're not here to play games. No, man. Terror's reality is one thing, but the reality is terror. Never figured I'd say that in my whole life. Even when I originally talked about this years ago, I never quite made that statement. I guess I'm just a little more clever now. But let's remember here, TK seemingly is more resilient than we'd imagine here. Because while the case might be very close to being closed by Chuck and company, there eventually comes another big problem. While the military enter Fortune City and First Light at around 9 o'clock on the third day that we're in Fortune City, they do in fact follow up with their plan. Sergeant Dwight Boykin, whom is the leader of the squad that entered the city, instructs his troops to go after the zombies, clean up, and then look for survivors. The first kill went to him, while the rest of his comrades did the exact same thing. They all shot down zombies and anything that moved, kind of like in the first game. But here, they have a bit more of a reason to rescue survivors and at least allow for the truth to come out. But until that happens, all Chuck, Katie, Stacy, Rebecca, Sullivan, they basically watch from a safe distance inside the safe house itself. And the monitors themselves showcase the soldiers unfortunately getting into contact with some kind of green gas that's coming from underground. When the zombies walk over it though, something happens. They mutate. Yes, these zombies are incredibly bad. I mean, they get a lot stronger, they get a lot faster, and worst of all, they projectile vomit some sort of acid, which burns some people. And unfortunately, the soldiers end up overrun with these mutant zombies. These mutants are that powerful. And as the gas quickly becomes a pretty difficult fog to go around, well, it turns out Fortune City not only had a zombie infestation, but now there's some sort of gas coming from below the city itself, possibly in the underground tunnels. And even though Rebecca, like I've said, she watched from a safe distance, she was actually more out there, like in person, but still more on the rooftops and whatnot. When the others from the safe house see that she is actually going to the garage that leads to the tunnels, Chuck decides to go after her. Even though Sullivan advised him not to, he still goes for it anyways. But the main thing here is that in addition to the zombies, we now have the mutants to worry about. And these guys, like I said, going up against them would be way worse. They're faster, they're stronger, they can take out more health if they latch onto you. And of course, there's that vomit that I mentioned. It's a pretty corrosive substance. And this mutation is certainly not like how when the Queen was put together here. No, man. Much like in the other game, Dead Rising 2 had its own Queen moment. But Chuck didn't accidentally step on it. He did it intentionally for the zombies to explode. The same sort of phenomenon that I've discussed in the other game. But either way you look at it, when Chuck finally does get to Rebecca's last known location, Sergeant Dwight is down there firing large amounts of magazines worth of machine gun ammo. Everything that moves, even Rebecca ended up getting incapacitated when he found out that she was watching him and following him basically. Chuck eventually intervenes, but Rebecca gets tossed into the back of a Humvee while Dwight ends up unloading more rounds. It's another epic boss fight here. You really gotta be wary of the large amounts of machine gun ammo he fires. It might as well be like trying to dodge a minigun, which, technically speaking, when TK's chopper was up in the air, that wasn't definitely a minigun that was attached. Here, it's more of a regular machine gun, kind of like the M249. But either way you look at it, though, this boss fight still does end on a pretty incredible note here. The ending and how Dwight is defeated, he at first is weakened. Then he sits down beside the Humvee while Chuck gets Rebecca out of there. And then he's basically on the fence of claiming that everything's a zombie now because of what happened to his squad mates. So he goes on a frag grenade activated suicide, blowing himself up. But thankfully, the two managed to get out of there right before the explosion happens. Rebecca, unfortunately, is injured because of what happened with Dwight, so Chuck now has to carry her up there. Unlike with the first game, remember when I said Dr. Barnaby got rescued and they spared us the agony of having to deal with a limping Brad? Well, in this game, you actually have to get Rebecca to the security room at the same time that you're defending yourself against the zombies and the mutants. So Talk about the challenge coming to us. Or I guess people might call it a classic case of karma. Either way you look at it though, when we do make it back to safety, well, it's wishful thinking. Safety probably is the last thing that fate would have planned for. Because even though that Rebecca is saved from Dwight, and now they have two different mysteries to solve here, the thing is, now they got to worry about what's going on outside. But something else happens. Somehow, the interior of the safe house had been breached. The main doors had been left wide open, leading large groups of zombies, mutants, and etc. to tear apart the innards of the safe house. Survivors are killed in a matter of moments, and the interior of the security room is being close to being breached. Chuck has to risk it and get out there, reset the power, get the doors to shut again, and basically wipe out all the zombies and whatnot that are inside, because otherwise a lot of horrible stuff will happen here. Talk about the complications really picking up once you get to this part of the story here. So this very morning alone had 3 big phenomenons. Pretty horrible ones. We had the military come in, hoping to rescue everybody and exterminate the zombies in Fortune City. Unfortunately, encountering some sort of gas. The soldiers are overrun. Sergeant Dwight ends up retreating to the underground zone with the maintenance tunnels, and Rebecca ends up following him down there. He has no idea what the gas is and what it's doing to the zombies, apart from what they're currently seeing. Those mutations that are happening. And then Chuck has to go down there to rescue Rebecca while dealing with Dwight. And when he does get back with Rebecca to the security room, they now have this. But hey, at least it's another big task that Chuck managed to accomplish. But even then, a 4th thing takes place. Well, the news station comes up again. Not exactly like how Rebecca does with her own broadcasts and what had gone on in Fortune City up until this point. But unfortunately, Channel 6, Action News, started to broadcast that the safe house was indeed breached and everybody was found dead. And then, of course, the rescue team had lost contact with the outside world. Supposedly, everybody had perished in the outbreak, and the president decided to rebuke the idea of rescuing anybody inside, leading to believe that nobody's alive anymore, and that military bombers with fire bombs are going to be used to wipe out the city. Zombies, people, everyone. So think about it. Much like how the government in the first game had to wipe out the mall of zombies, people, everyone, with their own guns and their own wits, led by Captain Brock, in this game, the soldiers and their leader, Sergeant Dwight, are overrun and defeated by the zombies as well as by Chuck. So the whole thing about this game really is more or less a couple of elements here and there that come straight out of Dead Rising. There's a lot of plot elements and a lot of references to what the first game did, and a lot of sequencing that's quite similar in a way. We don't exactly get all that much originality here. It's the same sort of general idea that plays around. You have a zombie outbreak that happens in a certain populated area. Almost everybody is eaten alive or torn apart, and it's up to one certain survivor to take on the entire zombie horde. So, by 3 days that come and go, the military would come along and get involved in all this. But let's be real here. There's always something that's going to go on and complicate things even further. But that's the main thing about these Dead Rising games. Why their stories are so well put together, nicely written, well acted across the board. And this makes me more than proud to appreciate these games even today, after more than 15-20 years of time had passed. But let's be real here. Back onto the story of Dead Rising 2, as it currently stands. Well, at the same time that the news broadcasts from Channel 6 Action News were going on with the wrong information being put out, there was also the unfortunate escape of TK himself. He somehow got out of his containment. He was handcuffed to the bed before, but he somehow got out of there. and, well, he ended up getting his shoulder bitten by a zombie. Chuck is forced to go get some Zombrex, but this is optional. And there's a few different endings in the game that go down, depending on what you do here. I know I haven't really talked much about the endings in the Dead Rising games, but the thing is that there's a lot of them to look forward to. You have several that go on in the first game, a few of which are also optional. You have B, C, D, E, and F, which can vary upon different things that you do. With Dead Rising 2, you have a similar sort of thing here. You have ending A as well as ending S, which are the true ending and the overtime / real true ending. You have ending B, which will end with the firebombers taking place. Ending C, D, E, and whatnot, in which that other things will happen, like Chuck getting grappled by the military, or a similar sort of ending as to what we saw with ending B. But either way you look at it, Dead Rising 2 still does have lots more to cover here. So, with the news broadcasts unaware of what's truly going on in Fortune City, and TK now being threatened with the zombie parasite, like I said, the Zombrex portion of TK is going to be an optional thing. And if you do pull it off, it'll guarantee you the true ending. Because what happens is that, well, Chuck shows TK that his daughter is better at handling it than he is. He is, after all, had his first dose. And boy, does Chuck really not like TK, giving him a slug punch in the process. But then Sullivan once again decides to interject with Chuck after the broadcast came and went that what he needs to do now is he needs to go find out the source of this gas and find out where it's all connected to. Maybe they'll get some clues as to what's really going on so that they can probably get a hold of Channel 6 Action News and tell them what really happened in Fortune City. Nobody is simply dead, as some sources claimed. But what's really going on there is that Chuck Green, the same man whom has been framed for being the man responsible for the outbreak, is also responsible for discovering the facts and what really happened down there. And so, that's what goes on. Up until this point, though, there are plenty of optional things that take place, but as soon as the military arrive on the morning of the third day in Fortune City, pretty much all side quests and all optional missions just fade off. There are plenty of other things that I could mention here, like boss fights. You have Snowflake and Ted, basically, friends between a special needs guy and a tiger. You have Slappy, the popular mascot in the Palisades Mall. You have Sheriff Seymour taking justice into his own hands. But you know what, though? One big trope I might as well mention here is that despite Chuck appearing pretty hard and pretty emotionless, well, he does crack up a few jokes every now and then. A dad, after all, has got to make some funny puns every now and then, don't you think? Thankfully, Katie was not there with him. Otherwise, she would have been horrified by the gore that's happening to these people that he encountered. Anyways, though, once Chuck does decide to find out what's going on with that gas and where it's coming from, he finds some sort of secret area, some sort of large testing center. This underground facility is supposedly home to a buttload of mercenaries. And there's 2 scientists inside. These 2 scientists are basically monitoring the gas as well as the compounds that allow for its manifestation. And while these guys are actually psychopaths that you can fight against, they are pretty darn simple. Just put some shots in them a few times. They might be holding guns, but all you gotta do is take them down with only a few shots each. Compared to most other psychopaths, there's a pretty big health bar that takes a lot of abuse, but these guys are pushovers. I don't know why they even bother making them psychopath boss fights when they're just as simple to take down as with most of the zombies. Either way you look at it, though, when these 2 guys are taken care of, Chuck takes a look at the computer and notices it's Phenatrans property. Phenatrans. This is the pharmaceutical company responsible for the production of Zombrex and the responsibility of selling it out to the public, whom are in need of it. Zombrex, as we probably know by now, is considered a hard-to-find, expensive, and high-in-demand product in the economy. And within 5 years since the first known administrative dosage was made by Isabella Keyes herself upon her injection into Frank West's hand, it's clear by now that Phenatrans had actually started this outbreak. Agencies coming around, people from their own corporate liability, had started this outbreak so they could drive up their own price in the stock market. They killed these people, framed Chuck Green, Cure, and many other people, even practically thrown good old Channel 6 Action News reporter Rebecca Chang under the bus, just so they could get away with a little extra money. So unlike with TK, whom practically played maybe a smaller part in this whole thing when at first he was judged for being the true man behind this whole nonsense, it was Phenatrans. This was a more corporate layout thing compared to a one-man operation. Although to be real, TK had his own goons and his own people alongside him, so maybe it's not exactly a full-on one-man band here, but still, just wait until you see what happens next, or at least hear for what happens next. From my perspective, the thing is that Chuck Green is hauling a laptop from Phenatrans, a satellite phone, and a cup of coffee that he stole from the scientists. He thanks them for it, as it was probably his favorite blend that he drank. But either way you look at it though, once he secures these items and takes them back to the security room, he belays all the information. Once he does though, Rebecca decides to call up her superiors back in Channel 6 Action News' studio, unfortunately to get shot in the head, point blank, by Sullivan. Yep, Raymond Sullivan. The guy whom is basically a security agent at Fortune City and probably one of the most reliable characters we have out here. He was probably like Otis in the first game, as he was responsible for giving out a lot of information, though Stacy also did a lot of assisting on that part. The real crazy thing though is that Sullivan is actually an agent of Phenatrans on their payroll and supposedly had just simply used this Fortune City security stuff and the entirety of the safe house as a guise. One could probably imagine what else he did. Oh man, he might as well be like Prospector Pete from Toy Story 2. Did a lot of conspiring, did a lot of stuff behind the characters' backs, all to execute his own superstitious plans. Well, for Sullivan, he was the one who opened the doors to the safe house, practically leading people to believe that everybody inside was dead, and Channel 6 Action News went on to declare that the military, president, as well as nearby officials had made Fortune City a certain zone for decimation by firebombers. And well, that seemingly is going to carry on until Chuck can actually get a hold of that phone, as Sullivan took it and ran off. Well, Chuck's now got to pursue him, and he goes up to the top of the building. The top of this casino in which they make their final stand. This rooftop area, though, where they fight upon, is not only the place where that Chuck and Raymond are going to be fighting each other, but there's also a plane above them for some reason. This plane, I guess you could say, is in a way much like what we got from other things that happened in the first game. I mean, there were choppers in the first game, tanks in the first game, but there's a full-on government plane heading above Fortune City. And it's basically acting as some sort of assistant to Sullivan, shooting it down every now and then and firing explosives. Talk about this being an intense final boss fight, which it surely does a good job at it too, because man, Sullivan's not even wearing much in terms of armor or defensive properties, but he still takes a lot of shots to put down. That is if you intend on using guns to take him down, which is possible to defeat him, mostly for that stuff. But as long as you have yourself a good amount of weapons and health, much like with the other psychopath battles, you will easily be able to defeat him. And man, his last moment might have made him seem like he had the upper hand, but with some quick thinking, Sullivan had activated his parachute, grabbed the satellite phone, and took away a majority of belongings, just so he could make a clean getaway. But what he didn't know was that Chuck would attach his body to a nearby steel bar. And in doing so, what happens is that the plane comes in, takes the parachute with it, and when Raymond supposedly gets caught in this whole thing, well, his body rips apart in half. So talk about quite an ending for a pretty bad character. So while Chuck is able to admire Sullivan's death, he's even more astounded by the fact that he now has what he's looking for. This phone he uses to contact Channel 6 Action News, and he's able to contact military officials, asking for rescue choppers and needing them right now. When they arrive, however, the remaining survivors and Chuck unfortunately don't quite see the likes of Stacy and Katie. The two somehow gone missing. There's also little to no sign of TK either. So Chuck, rather than getting on the chopper, as requested, decides to go back down to the security room and find out for himself where they might be at. Well, they're just missing. Simple as that. But a nearby radio goes off. Apparently TK now has a radio for himself, talking to Chuck from it in an unknown location. Whatever's going on, well, TK has Stacy and Katie with them. And he plans to keep them hostage. He plans to reignite terrorist reality in his own way. But this is basically the segue to which that overtime takes place. The thing is, in order for Katie and Stacy to get back to Chuck, Chuck needs to grab a few things for TK as well. So unlike the first game, which Isabella had Frank go and retrieve some equipment as well as some queens for her to administrate a dose of the precursor to Zombrex, in this case, TK just finds a bunch of random junk, asks Chuck to go pick them all up for him, and once he finally does relay the location for Chuck to get to, which is back at the arena, right where this whole thing started, well, Chuck looks for TK, gets zapped, knocked down, and brought unconscious by TK's taser, pretty much. But when Chuck comes to, he's hanging from the ceiling. Oh man. It gets even crazier when you know the fact that the real reason that TK brought the three over there in the first place is because now he is hoping to feed all three of them to the zombies. But Chuck was able to get out of there. He was able to climb up the rope, get to the upper rafters, in which that he can use the crank to operate the winch. It'll pull Stacy and Katie back up to the top. But upon TK noticing this, he decides to intercept. He kicks the crank, setting it down at a pretty low point. The final battle begins. While TK is certainly not like some crazy military commander of some sorts, he still is a pretty formidable opponent. Just think about it. You're unarmed, kind of like in the first game. But you will have access to certain items, including some consumables, as well as some maybe not so good weapons there. But as long as you can do that, along with the added challenge of preventing Katie and Stacy from reaching the bottom, well, if you want to know what happens when you lose either thing that goes down, well, you get sent all the way back to the beginning of overtime. Yep, before you collected all those items and before you got handed the location of your final destination, upon which the battle with TK begins. Yeah, you get sent all the way back there. The save option, for the most part, are the restrooms. In the first game and the second game, the restrooms are typically the save points in which that you can manually save the game. Not much in terms of auto-saving. But if you actually do manage to beat TK, you'll get just as epic of an ending, if not better than the first. Because on top of Chuck Green claiming the fame and money for himself, he gets to beat the showman himself. TK does try to push him off the edge. Chuck then grapples him and throws him over. That famous quote, "You've got to be willing to risk it all if you're ever really gonna win big." Yep, Chuck basically finished his famous words for him as he falls to his death. So, that's the end of TK for you. Didn't turn into a zombie, unless you skip the Zombrex portion of the game, which happens a little while before your battle with Sullivan. Other than that though, Chuck successfully rescues Katie and Stacy, and the three eventually make their way out. But that's not over. We get jump scared by a zombie right before the credits. Whoa. That was pretty incredible. Just think, this was a few years before Five Nights at Freddy's. And even with the altered version of Dead Rising 2 called Dead Rising 2 Off the Record, which is more of a Frank West version of Dead Rising 2, the same sort of thing does happen, but there are a lot of notable changes in this one compared to the last. So, I probably will mention real quickly though that in addition to Case Zero, there was also a DLC that takes place after the original game called Case West. Basically, the likes of Katie, Stacy, and Chuck are finding their way out, but Chuck eventually gets word that there is somebody trying to produce a cure. A cure for the likes of these zombie parasites. And upon bumping into the one and only Frank West, the duo actually make their way through. Just think, this was kind of an event, probably not as incredible as with Freddy Krueger versus Jason Voorhees, or with Godzilla versus King Kong, or with any of those unique monumental battles between two iconic characters in a certain franchise. The thing is that with Chuck Green and Frank West together as one, we don't really get that anymore. It does seem that perhaps because of the success of Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster, maybe we'll be seeing a Dead Rising 2 Deluxe Remaster, but only time will tell on that part. Probably the big thing about Case West though, is that it does helps to solidify the final circle in the story here. Because they infiltrate a facility guarded by Sun then, as well as a certain scientist. And she is not only laced with battle scars, but she does have a way for keeping Frank and Chuck far away from the cure as possible. And with a heavily armed Middle Eastern dude, who unfortunately succumbs to the loads of queens that are ejected from the nearby deposit box. Yeah, it's pretty nuts, I will say, compared to that of Case Zero or the original game itself. Either way you look at it though, when you put Case Zero, the original game, and Case West all together, it is still an unbelievable story. Probably one of the best things in zombie gaming history. This is arguably even better than the original, but I can't quite say it ultimately surpassed every possible expectation. Even with my most recent revisiting of the game, Dead Rising 2 Remastered, or the original, depending on which way you look at it, doesn't exactly hit up all the high marks you could possibly have as much as the original did. Because the original felt like a groundbreaking piece, and Dead Rising 2 managed to make things a whole lot better with the addition of a lot of new elements, including the combination weapons, as well as the more unique system of multi-phased psychopath boss fights. Because sometimes there's instances where you gotta fight two psychopaths at once, and not just one like in the original. No matter how I look at it though, this is still probably one of the greatest sequels to any video game I have ever played or seen in my whole life. It was treated as more of an iconic event, like the sequel to a massive blockbuster in the theaters. Like I could probably talk about Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, how much of an event that was at the time. But that'd be a little too out of context. So for the scoring, we'll go ahead and give it a solid 9.4 out of 10.1. Quite big as it is, and reminder, for tomorrow, I'll be talking about Dead Rising 2 Off the Record.